Hey everyone, Mr. Davitt here. This is my lesson on the U.S. President's Review Part 2, and I call it review because if you've watched the other videos, you know about these presidents already. But this is just where I take some time to kind of talk about some key points of their presidency and their administration, and I also try to put one kind of word or one kind of phrase together that helps show kind of what I think is a big legacy for them. And it's also part two because I put a part one out before the AP exam, just going up through Truman and World War II because that was all the AP exam was covering. But now that I've done the rest of these lessons and we've gotten up to, all the way to the present, this allows an opportunity to kind of talk about the remaining presidents. So, just again, these are key points, and we'll get going here. So, the last one that I did include Truman, but only kind of to World War II. And that's because all the AP exam was covering. But there's a lot more to Truman's presidency than just World War II. By the time he takes over, it's at the end. And the nickname I give for Truman is the accidental president. And the reason why is because he largely was never supposed to be president. He was largely put on the ballot in 1944 to gain some extra votes for FDR. And then with FDR's death, he becomes president. But I put a question mark there because a lot of the things he does have huge significance. So first off, again, he does make the decision to drop the two atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And it's Truman that is president at the start of the Cold War. So certainly we wouldn't necessarily totally blame Truman for the Cold War, but if we're thinking about the way things progress, Truman absolutely plays a role in Cold War developments. It'll be Truman that adopts the policy of containment, and we really see him pursue this. And this will largely be U.S. policy throughout the Cold War: contain communism where it already exists. And so his Truman Doctrine, his Marshall Plan, will largely kind of set the precedent for what will become future Cold War policy. We'll also see a desegregation of the military that will occur during Truman's presidency. That's pretty monumental considering that civil rights movement really hadn't taken a big leap quite at this point. So Truman's definitely ahead of his time by desegregating the military, and this will just largely set the foundation for what will come later on. If you want to think about where Truman gets some negative marks and definitely in public perception, it'd have to be in the Korean War, where he takes that idea of containment but takes it one step further through the launching of U.S. troops. But other than that, we're really talking about a president who was responsible for navigating the early Cold War and setting up a lot of significant policies that would set the foundation for later Cold War presidents. Next up is Eisenhower, our Republican president from 1953 to 1961. And I put a new look here with a question mark because Eisenhower's new look policy will definitely look somewhat different than earlier policy by Truman, but certainly some similarities. So I'll get into that in just a little bit. Eisenhower's a World War II war hero, and I mentioned that for a couple reasons. One, the Americans believed that as a war hero, he would be able to help lead the country through the Cold War, but also because the United States does like to do this, elect war heroes as presidents. Some turn out well, some do not, but Eisenhower is definitely one that turns out relatively well. When we're looking at the new look, what's new? Well, we're definitely looking at a huge arms race developing. Um, Through this. This is mutually assured destruction. This is just a huge buildup of nuclear weapons to the point of if the Cold War ever got to hot action, it could mean the destruction of the world. New look also, which is kind of an underlying thing, is the use of the CIA to implement coups abroad. And that had a lot to do with Eisenhower's distrust of communism and the idea that the United States needed to contain. And so definitely bringing this one step further, actually using the CIA in order to get rid of undesirable regimes and rulers. Best examples of that would be Nicaragua and also Iran. Definitely, Eisenhower sees a continuation of Truman with Cold War tensions, really still very, very tense with the Soviet Union, even though Stalin dies early in Eisenhower's presidency, which could have meant an opportunity to improve relations, but we never quite see that. At home, Dwight Eisenhower sees economic growth continue from the post World War II period, but also he is responsible for the construction of massive highways across the country connecting the United States in a lot of big ways. So that highway infrastructure is largely Eisenhower's responsibility, and that's something that we know today. As far as civil rights, a lot of things happened during Eisenhower's presidency. Brown versus Board, Little Rock Nine, etc. But we don't really see Eisenhower taking too strong of action. He does send in troops to get the students to school at Central High School in Little Rock, but that seemed to be more a show of presidential power over state power than anything else. So a little bit different than what we know before. Okay, next person I want to talk about is John F. Kennedy, Democrat, serving from 1961 to 1963. And because of his tragic assassination, I put more to be accomplished. Because what Kennedy does is he sets kind of a foundation for a lot of things that will continue. And the argument could be made that if he was not tragically assassinated and his life was not did not end early, could have seen these actually play out during his presidency. But most people still credit a lot of this to him, or at least starting things up. So first off, John F. Kennedy's the first Catholic president. Pretty big deal. He remains right now to be the only Catholic president. So um, interesting and big for the Catholics in the United States, who, if you remember, when they came in the 1840s, were heavily discriminated against. If you remember, it was Kennedy that said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." And a great example of that is the implementation of the Peace Corps with American students going or young Americans going overseas in order to provide education, technical assistance, and kind of improve U.S. relations. So that's fantastic. His program for helping end poverty and increased Social Security and other things like that is the New Frontier. The Frontier only achieves a little bit of success during Kennedy's presidency, but it has some. And one part of the New Frontier, other than poverty, is definitely the space race, where we see Kennedy allocating a lot more money to NASA and other things like that in order to get things together. The Bay of Pigs is definitely a poor moment in Kennedy's presidency, where the failed CIA coup goes wrong and Castro is able to solidify his anti-Americanism, which is obviously troubling. But he's able to regain popularity and regain the Americans' trust in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he's really seen as being a great diplomat and great negotiator with the Soviets, and is successfully able to get them to take the missiles out of Turkey. So definitely would be a aspiring achievement. Civil rights does become much more of a priority under Kennedy as he helps escort the Freedom Riders, and as things kind of get more tense throughout the 1960s, he decides that it really is a moral issue of civil rights, and he really tries to get working on a civil rights bill. However, that and many other Kennedy initiatives get cut short in his tragic assassination, November 1963, in Dallas, Texas. So, again, more to be accomplished, but a solid foundation. A lot of the foundation that Kennedy's able to start is going to be continued, at least at the beginning, by Lyndon Johnson, Democrat president from 1963 to 1969. However, early successes are going to be overshadowed by Vietnam, but I really want to make sure it's understood that although Vietnam is largely what people remember about Johnson's presidency, there's a lot more that we should consider. So, early successes in the period, okay, especially when he takes over, those big successes come in civil rights victories, as he's able to use Kennedy's death largely as a rallying cry to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and then later the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Real concrete pieces of legislation that are going to dramatically improve the situation for blacks, especially in the southern part of the United States. Johnson's other big domestic program, the Great Society and the plan to end poverty, was very ambitious, but it made a lot of sense considering the situation that had developed with how rampant poverty was in the United States. With that being said, everything is going to get kind of overshadowed for Johnson because of Vietnam. Johnson gets himself into the commitment trap that had already been established before him, billions of dollars into Vietnam, 20,000 military advisors there by the time Johnson takes over. And so it was almost inevitable that Johnson got stuck in there. However, it was Johnson that got Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution under relatively suspect circumstances, and because of that and because of the green light he was given in order to basically allocate as many troops, as much money, and whatever else as he deemed as being necessary, it will be Johnson that is given full blame for the failures of Vietnam. So that is a sad reality that we have to deal with. Vietnam so tarnishes LBJ's legacy that he will not make the decision to run for re-election in 1968, which is very, very rare, but a sign of his huge unpopularity at the time. Because of the Democratic backlash, we do have a Republican president in 1969. This is Richard Nixon, serving until 1974. Watergate. Similar to Johnson, Nixon's presidency is often overshadowed by controversy and by scandal. But the reality is, up to that point, Nixon's presidency had some successful achievements. One of the ones that's a little more suspect is on the campaign trail, Nixon said, "I'm getting us out of Vietnam." However, when Nixon takes over, he actually has Vietnamization, which has some degree of the U.S. leaving, but at the same time also sees an increase in bombings and an increase in attacks. But that had a lot to do with the fact that Nixon was trying to achieve peace with honor, which he was technically able to achieve. However, a lot of that was successful due to Nixon's decision to improve relations with China and his visit to China in 1972, going to be monumental for U.S. foreign policy and the real first concrete steps into a normalization of relations with China, both economically, later politically. So this is really big. The other thing that Nixon is responsible for is the move to détente with the Soviet Union. And it will be under Nixon that some concrete agreements are able to be made in order to really ease the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States that almost led to full-blown military assault nuclear weapon craziness with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So definitely responsible for easing those things, coming out with some good agreements that were able to be successful. With that being said, though, Nixon will always be remembered for Watergate and his role in the cover-up of the break into the Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate Hotel, and as he resigns, his reputation becomes totally ruined. Again, Nixon's the first president to resign, remains the only president to resign, and the reality is, if he had not resigned, he would have been the first president to be fully impeached. So that's the reality of Nixon. After Nixon comes his vice president, Gerald Ford, and I use this nickname, the partner, because this is what most people remember about Gerald Ford. Even though Truman is considered the accidental president, Ford is really the real accidental president, because if you remember, he was not even elected vice president. He took over because of the resignation of Spiro Agnew before Nixon was it what resigned, and then Ford took over as vice president. So not even elected vice president, and then he becomes the president amidst the Watergate scandal. The biggest thing that we remember usually about Ford is his presidential pardon given to Nixon, which really cast a lot of further illegitimacy on government and its role, and really was something that still lingers around with Ford today. Outside of the pardon, he's going to continue detente with the Soviet Union. He will be the orchestrator of the Helsinki Accords. Problem is, as Ford continues detente, there's more and more of the American public that don't really think it's a great situation and that they should move away from it. It will be Ford that will see the official end of Vietnam, even though technically under Nixon's presidency, American troops were withdrawn. The South Vietnamese were still fighting the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, and it's during Ford's presidency where that officially ends as South Vietnam falls to North Vietnam. Ford, very much a short presidency. It's quick, and really it just serves the purpose of kind of ending Nixon's presidency more than anything kind of substantial within and of itself. That means that our next president is going to be the Democrat Jimmy Carter from Georgia, serving from 1977 to 1981. And I use this abbreviation or this nickname, the outsider that never quite got in, because that's largely how Carter portrayed himself. He was a Georgia peanut farmer. Again, he then became governor of Georgia. But what he said amidst Watergate, Vietnam, etc., is that I'm an outsider and I will not lie to you. And that really attracted a lot of people who were upset, basically, with government still not treating them right and feeling distrusted and other things like that. Jimmy Carter's foreign policy will be largely a human rights policy, and he'll make that very clear. But if we really think about the execution of human rights under Carter, it's complicated because some countries it's easy to criticize and it's easy to take action, but other countries, for example, China, that's going to be a little more challenging to actually be able to do. Carter's highlight of his presidency would have to be probably the Camp David Accords, where he gets a substantial agreement signed between Israel and Egypt, something that really had kind of been attempted before, but hadn't really made too much progress, and it's Carter that's able to get them to negotiate and work things out. That's really impressive. The reality is the Iranian Revolution will totally throw that victory aside for Carter, and the Iranian hostage crisis, further adding fuel to the flame for critics about Carter's inadequacies and his inability to deal with the crisis. And finally, the oil crisis that takes place because of the Iranian Revolution will make things even worse for Carter at home as people wait in the long lines to get gas and other things like that. Talk about Carter, he's not necessarily a very good president. Some his own problems, some though problems he somewhat inherited. But Carter is one of the few presidents in American history that will go on post-presidency to be incredibly successful, even garnering a Nobel Peace Prize. Okay, the next president is Ronald Reagan, 1981 to 1989, and really the conservative hero if you want to think about anyone. No more government. Well, that's kind of, simple, but no more big government, Reagan says. And that's going to be largely an effective rallying cry in 1980 because people were suspicious of government and were sick of what had taken place. Reagan's economic policy, known as Reaganomics, supply side economics, tax cuts, less government spending, and really slashing the government budget, particularly on social programs. With that being said, Reaganomics and Reagan's economic policy is somewhat unique because it did see the increase in the arms race as basically Reagan wanted to negotiate with the Soviet Union to try to end the Cold War, but he only wanted to do so from a position of dominance. So in the early time, we see an increase in Cold War tension. He calls the Soviet Union the evil empire, and he wants to get that going. With that being said, When Gorbachev comes to power later on and seems willing to reform, and when it's clear that the U.S. has achieved that dominance, Reagan will make deals with Gorbachev that will effectively end the Cold War. Now, with that being said, it's not Reagan that's solely responsible. Gorbachev's reforms, the people inside the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe being ready for a change are all things we want to acknowledge here. The other thing that's happens under Reagan's presidency is the Iran-Contra affair. That being said, Reagan is largely able to deflect blame for that, and again, it was determined that it was just bad oversight on his part. But, Reagan was a pretty well-liked guy, so he was able to use that effectively to help increase his support. Our next president going to be George H.W. Bush, the Republican, serving from 1989 to 1993. And I put this here because he's not quite Reagan. Because remember, he was Reagan's vice president, so they put him up kind of hoping that he would continue Reagan's initial conservative policies. Well, he definitely continues that conservatism, definitely moves in that direction. And it will be H.W. that sees the official end of the Cold War and the official end of the Soviet Union. So that would be a high point of the presidency. However, he struggled kind of with China, especially with Tiananmen Square massacre, where China fired upon its citizens, and Bush wouldn't go as far as really taking heavy action, which was troubling. We also see the first Gulf War going on under H.W.'s presidency, really a show of American dominance, definitely a high point for H.W. The reality is, though, the foreign policy successes that Bush is able to have are not necessarily going to be enough to alleviate his economic issues and problems, as H.W. sees immense tax hikes take place, as he tries to combat the economic crisis, something he promised not to do, and this will kind of lead to a lack of continued support for H.W. Against that context, we have Bill Clinton taking over in 1993, serving 2 terms till 2001, and he coins himself a New Democrat. I'll largely say that's fine. So he says, hey, look, I'm a Democrat, but I'm not necessarily as big government heavy as maybe FDR or some of our bigger New Deal Democrats. And he tries to achieve a middle ground. And he does so in many cases throughout his presidency. He does fail on healthcare reform with his wife Hillary leading the task force, and the bill basically goes nowhere in the Congress. But the big success for Clinton would have to be the economic growth that occurs throughout his presidency. And again, it's not Clinton that necessarily is fully responsible for it. There's things happening within the United States society as a whole that are going to contribute. But nonetheless, this is something we definitely give him credit. He's able to balance budgets for the first time in many years during his presidency. So again, continued economic success here. Talk about foreign policy for Clinton, a little bit of mixed foreign policy. He's able to broker the Good Friday Agreement and play a big role in that. However, he decides not to intervene in the Rwandan genocide. So, hit and miss here and there. But when we think about Clinton, we definitely think about his scandal that erupts with Monica Lewinsky. But the reality is this does not necessarily damage Bill Clinton as much as maybe at another time, because the economic success is enough for a lot of Americans to kind of forgive Bill Clinton and move on. Next president would be George H.W. Bush. Here he is, serving from 2001 to 2009. When I get to some of these later presidents, I don't give too much of nickname kind of consideration, only because we have to kind of see how things play out. So W, I just put W because that is something he kind of said about himself. That's what a lot of people called him, and that way we're able to differentiate him from HW. Well, George W. Bush comes into power with the election of 2000, a very contested election, a lot of controversy as to whether or not he should have even been president, but that's going to be largely sidelined with 9/11. And in 9/11, we did see Bush able to rally the American people. His response initially was seen as being appropriate and responsible, and his decision to send troops to Afghanistan, that was seen as something that was really smart. And so we saw a lot of kind of American unity with the decision to go to Afghanistan, go after Osama bin Laden, go after the Al Qaeda. That was seen as being good. However, Bush's decision to go to war in Iraq was something we saw lead to a lot of disunity and other things going on as well, with kind of Bush's very conservative approach to social issues that's going to really alienate pro-life versus pro-choice, pro-gay marriage, anti-gay marriage, a lot of those things really coming together. Bush is able to be reelected by a narrow margin in 2004. However, his second term is dealt with more issues than successes, as Hurricane Katrina and his poor response definitely is noted, and the economic troubles from his tax cuts and other things really show problems for Americans up through his second term. Talk about Bush, we definitely talk about divisiveness, and again, he's not necessarily fully responsible for that. There's a lot of things going on, but this is a lot of, again, social issues divisiveness, also a lot of divisiveness over the war in Iraq. So a tough time in American society, as there's a lot of kind of button heads between Republicans and Democrats. Okay, let's talk about Barack Obama and serving from 2009 to 2017. And I just put Obama here because that name symbolizes a lot of things, I think, for a lot of different people, but a significant president. Why? Well, first off, his presidency is historic, becoming the first African American to become president. So really, really significant there. He comes in with a bad economic situation. His decision to provide stimulus, recovery, and bailout for major companies, seen by some as being kind of socialist, but nonetheless will help solve the economic crisis that had taken place in the late 2000s. He also does accomplish healthcare reform through the Affordable Care Act. Again, some drawing controversy of this, but nonetheless, providing a change in regards to how Americans are able to get their health care situated. Obama takes over with a messy situation in regards to Iraq and Afghanistan. He's able to pull the troops largely out of Iraq, some still remaining in Afghanistan, but he's largely able to de-escalate American commitment. Some changing of U.S. foreign policy under Obama with his decision to try to improve relations with Cuba, which was definitely something that had not really happened since the Cuban Revolution, and some economic recovery that will start to really set in by the later part of Obama's presidency. Okay, last president, who's our current president, Donald Trump, and again, I just put 45 because the reality is we're really way too early to exactly know how successful or unsuccessful Trump is as a president. But a couple kind of notes here. Trump is a historic victor. No past political experience, no past military experience, really the only president where that was the case. Definitely changing U.S. foreign policy. He went after China, made that decision, went kind of after some traditional U.S. allies, and then got closer with some historic U.S. enemies. So that's definitely a change. Again, he met with North Korea, which was kind of an interesting decision and definitely different from what we've seen before. Definitely see him capitalizing on that initial economic growth from the later part of Obama, and the initial part of his presidency definitely saw huge gains in the stock market, low unemployment, other economic successes. However, Donald Trump's presidency has definitely seen heavy divisiveness. We've seen a lot of issues between Republicans, Democrats, and other things like that. And he does something which is really the first time we've seen this, which is uses Twitter to announce his policies and announce his kind of opinions and what he's thinking. And so I call this Twitter diplomacy as he does that. With that being said, Trump's economic growth has been largely hit because of the pandemic and the health crisis, health emergency brought on by COVID-19. And obviously the other big thing hitting society, Black Lives Matter. So again, way too early to know his full responses to this, as this is just kind of setting and establishing a precedent, but nonetheless, we want to kind of consider all the various things going on. So thanks so much. I hope you enjoy yourself, and we will talk soon. I hope you liked learning a little bit more about the president.